Imagine stepping out onto a chaotic, smoke-filled battlefield. The air is thick with black powder smoke. The noise is just deafening, and absolute pandemonium surrounds you.
Yeah, that sounds like a nightmare scenario.
Right, it is total chaos. You are holding a loaded weapon, your heart is pounding out of your chest, but there is one massive, terrifying problem.
You cannot see anything.
Well, worse than that. As you look through the fog of war at the thousands of soldiers running around you, you realize that absolutely no one's wearing a uniform.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, no one is flying a flag. No one has a recognizable insignia. In that scenario, you have no idea who to strike, who to protect, or even which direction to march.
You are just as likely to fire on your own allies as you are to hit the opposing force.
Precisely. It's total catastrophic confusion. So welcome to Reformed Thinking. Back in 1871, a man named Charles Haddon Spurgeon looked out at the religious landscape of his day and realized that many congregations were doing that precise thing.
You were just blending in.
Yeah, they were blending into the mud, rolling up their flags and hiding their colors in the middle of a war. So today we are undertaking a massive deep dive into a text Spurgeon preached called The Church as She Should Be.
And the source material for this analysis is really fascinating. It is grounded in a rather poetic and surprising verse from the Old Testament.
Yeah, it is Song of Solomon, chapter 6, verse 4.
Right. In that passage, the bridegroom describes his bride with these striking words. He says, "Thou art beautiful, O my love, as Tirzah, comely as Jerusalem, terrible as an army with banners."
Now, we are going to look really closely at that because when the surrounding culture looks at a local congregation today, it usually sees, a social club or maybe an outdated institution, or perhaps just a target for scorn and mockery.
Oh, for sure. That is the standard cultural view.
But Christ looks at his bride and sees a heavily armed battalion with hoisted flags, fully prepared for battle, and striking absolute fear into her foes.
It is a massive contrast.
It really is. So over the next hour, we are going to unpack the mechanics of why a congregation of ordinary people is compared to a military force, what those hoisted flags actually represent in real life, and why she's considered genuinely terrible to the darkness around her.
Setting the stage with that battlefield imagery is incredibly helpful, I think, because it captures the urgency of the text right out of the gate.
Yeah, it gives you that visceral feeling.
Right. And Spurgeon begins his analysis by addressing the concept of evaluation. He points out that if you look around, you will find various estimates of the Christian faith and the people who hold it.
Which is still super common today. Everyone has an opinion.
Totally. But he argues that almost all of these cultural estimates are completely invalid. He identifies two extreme groups right away.
Okay, who are they?
On one side, you have the ritualists. These are the people who elevate the physical institution itself into an object of idolatry.
Oh, I see, like obsessing over the aesthetics.
Yeah. Exactly. They look at the architecture, the vestments, the hierarchy, and they worship the structure rather than the Savior.
That makes sense.
And then on the flip side, you have the rationalistic skeptics. These are the critics who spend all their time vilifying the congregation. They try to tear her down, dissect her flaws, and mock her beliefs at every conceivable opportunity.
So they're just constantly on the attack.
Right. And Spurgeon argues that neither of these groups possesses a valid opinion. They do not hold any genuine spiritual knowledge, so their assessments are worthless.
Which is a bold claim to make.
It is. But he says the only accurate judgment, the only opinion that carries any legitimate weight in the universe comes from the husband.
The divine bridegroom.
Yes, Jesus Christ is the only one equipped to evaluate the bride. And when he looks at her, he declares the king's daughter is all glorious within.
Which is a huge statement of grace.
It is. This establishes a massive baseline of unmerited grace. The bridegroom looks at these gathered people and sees a majestic, holy dignity. He perceives her consecration.
Meaning he looks at her and declares her to be without spot, based entirely on his own redeeming work.
Precisely. It is a declarative assessment.
I really appreciate that analogy of the husband's assessment, but I want to push back on it right away.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because taking that concept at face value could sound incredibly dangerous to a modern ear. Think about how that plays out in the real world.
Right, in a practical sense.
Yeah. If you want the most accurate character assessment of a married woman, you do not go and ask the gossiping neighbors who live down the street and only see her taking out the trash.
No, you definitely would not do that.
You do not ask her bitter enemies, and you do not ask the people who blindly flatter her to get something from her. You ask her husband.
Because he knows her best.
Right. He sees her character in the quiet moments. He knows her flaws, but he loves her comprehensively. So, applying that to a local congregation makes logical sense. We should only care about the husband's assessment.
So where is the pushback?
Well, here's my pushback.
Yeah.
Doesn't this give toxic or abusive churches a massive free pass?
Ah, I see what you mean.
If a church is doing terrible things, covering up scandals or hurting people, couldn't the leadership just look at the critical culture and say, well, the world is just full of gossiping neighbors. We don't care what the culture says about us because Jesus is our husband and he thinks we are beautiful.
That is a very real concern.
So how do we reconcile this idea that the bridegroom sees her as without spot when we know that actual historical congregations are full of glaring spots and massive failures?
That is a brilliant point of friction, and it requires us to understand the mechanics of what Spurgeon is actually describing here.
Okay, break that down for us.
He is not giving congregations a license to excuse their sin or ignore legitimate calls for repentance. When he says the bridegroom sees her as without spot, he's talking about the legal and spiritual reality of justification.
Okay. The theological mechanism.
Yes, we are talking about the imputation of righteousness. Let me break down how that mechanism works. Imagine a courtroom where a judge is looking at a completely bankrupt debtor who owes millions.
A total financial disaster.
Right. Now, if a wealthy benefactor steps in, pays the debt in full, and legally transfers his own perfect credit score to that debtor, the judge now looks at the debtor and declares him financially flawless.
Even though the debtor did nothing to earn it.
Exactly. The debtor did not earn that status, and he might still have terrible spending habits he needs to fix on a daily basis.
But his legal standing is perfect.
Precisely. In the same way, the king's assessment of his bride rests entirely on the fact that he has legally transferred his own perfect righteousness to her account.
He loves her, he cleanses her, and he presents her to himself.
Yeah. The majestic dignity he sees is accredited dignity. It does not mean the local congregation ignores its own sin. In fact, understanding that unmerited grace should make a congregation the most fiercely repentant people on earth.
Because they realize what it costs to give them that standing.
Exactly. But it does mean that their fundamental identity is not defined by the mockery of the skeptic or the flattery of the ritualist. She bears herself with the rank and status given to her by her Lord.
That is a crucial distinction.
And the question for you, listening right now, is whose evaluation you are prioritizing.
That hits close to home.
It really does. When you look at your own local congregation, do you evaluate it based on the metrics of corporate success, cultural relevance, and societal approval? Or do you view it through the lens of this imputed majestic dignity?
That distinction between legal standing and behavioral perfection clears up a lot of the confusion.
I am glad that helps frame it.
So she has this majestic dignity, but she is not just sitting passively on a velvet cushion receiving compliments. The text shifts gears drastically and introduces the central metaphor.
Which is the church as a military force.
Yeah, she is an army with banners. This brings us right into the concept of distinction in a world of compromise.
She is a militant force operating in an enemy's country.
Fighting for truth against error and fighting for light against darkness. And Spurgeon leans heavily into the military history of the 19th century to paint this picture.
He really knew his history.
He starts rolling out this massive catalog of uniforms and flags to make a singular point about the necessity of identifying troops.
It is quite the list.
He really is. He mentions the gray coats of the Russians in the Crimean War. He talks about the white livery of the Austrians in Lombardy, the Black Brunswickers, the French Guards, the Hussars, the Garibaldians, the French tricolor, and the German black and white.
He is practically giving a masterclass on European military attire.
Seriously. But he's doing it to show that banners and uniforms exist, first and foremost, for the sake of distinction. You have to know who is on the field.
Otherwise, you have the chaos we talked about at the beginning.
Right. I mentioned that chaotic battlefield in the introduction, but help us understand the historical reality of this. Why was physical distinction so absolutely critical in the warfare of Spurgeon's day?
To understand the metaphor, you have to understand the mechanics of 19th century warfare.
Okay, set the scene for us.
This was the era of black powder. When a battle commenced, thousands of muskets and cannons would fire, and within minutes, the entire valley would be choked with dense, blinding, white, sulfurous smoke.
So you could not see a thing?
Basically zero visibility. You could not see the faces of the men 20 yards in front of you.
That is terrifying.
In that terrifying confusion, the only way a commander could organize his troops, and the only way a soldier knew which way to charge or who to rally behind, was by looking up above the smoke.
Looking up at what?
They had to see the massive, brightly colored banners hoisted high on the large poles.
Ah, so the flags were practical, not just decorative.
Exactly. The bright colors of the uniforms, like the Austrian white or the French tricolor, were not for fashion. They were survival mechanisms.
That makes total sense.
If you rolled up your flag and put on a mud-colored coat to hide, you would be slaughtered by your own artillery. Distinction meant life. Blending in meant death.
Wow. Distinction meant life. And so how does he map that onto theology?
Well, Spurgeon takes that visceral reality and applies it directly to the theological battles of his era and, by extension, to ours.
He goes after the culture of his day.
He launches a fierce critique of what he called the broad church cry.
What was the broad church cry?
This was a movement in his day that basically argued for erasing theological boundaries. They wanted a church so broad, so inclusive of differing beliefs, that it didn't really stand for anything specific.
So they were basically taking down the banner.
Right. It was an attempt to take down the banners and put on camouflage to avoid offending anyone.
Just blending in to survive.
Yes. And Spurgeon argues that the modern hatred of creeds is driven by this same cowardice. A creed is simply a banner.
That is a great way to put it.
It is a short, handy, efficient weapon that declares exactly what a congregation believes.
I always assumed the word creed just referred to a dusty, archaic document that theologians argued over in a library.
A lot of people think that.
But you are saying Spurgeon viewed creeds as tactical battlefield equipment. That completely changes the framing.
It makes them vital for survival.
And he specifically targets this concept of neology. I hear that word, and it sounds like an obscure academic term.
It does sound pretty dry.
But reading through the source material, it sounds suspiciously like the exact same mechanism behind modern deconstruction.
Oh, it absolutely is.
It was the new theology of his day that sought to reinvent the Christian faith, sanding down the rough, offensive edges of the biblical text to make it more palatable to modern sensibilities.
They want to remove the friction.
Exactly. So Spurgeon is essentially yelling, "Up with your banners, soldiers of the cross!" If you hide what you believe, you are going to be mistaken for political partisans or social activists or ambitious adventurers.
The world has to know whose we are.
Right. But if banners just identify who is on the field, what stops this from just being a chaotic mob of people waving flags and yelling at the culture? How do these banners actually function beyond mere identification?
Identifying the troops is only the first step. The banners do far more than that. They organize the soldiers for the actual fight.
Okay, tell us about that organization.
This introduces the concept of the order of the host. Banners create discipline. To illustrate this, Spurgeon reaches back into the Old Testament to the book of Numbers, looking at how the Israelites camped in the wilderness.
Oh, that is a great visual.
It was not a sprawling, chaotic mob of 2 million people pitching tents wherever they felt like it. There's a massive intentional structure.
Right, God gave them very specific instructions.
Exactly. In the very center of the camp was the tabernacle, and later, the brazen serpent lifted high by Moses. That was the central standard.
The focal point for everyone.
Yes. Then, organized precisely around that center point, you had the banners of the 12 tribes.
And those were specific images, right?
Historically, Jewish tradition holds that the banner of Judah bore the image of a lion, Reuben a man, Joseph an ox, and Dan an eagle. They had designated quadrants.
So they knew exactly where to go.
When the cloud moved, they packed up and marched in a specific, unbreakable order.
That level of organization is incredible.
To help his listeners grasp why this organization is so vital, Spurgeon contrasts incredibly vivid metaphors.
The graveyard and the vineyard.
Yes. First, he asks you to imagine the rows of graves in a cemetery. Go to any military graveyard and you will see perfect order.
Like Arlington.
Exactly. The white marble headstones are aligned with laser precision. Everything is numbered, everything is registered, the grass is manicured, and it is completely silent.
It is perfect order, but it is entirely devoid of life.
Right. Then he asks you to look at the long lines of festooned fruit trees in Italy.
An Italian vineyard.
In an Italian vineyard, you see thick, heavy vines tied to posts, stretching in long rows. At first glance, it might look a bit messy with leaves and branches everywhere, but it is heavily structured.
The posts and wires give it shape.
The posts hold the vines up, the tying guides the growth, and it is absolutely bursting with grapes and noisy with the activity of the harvest. That is order with life.
That visual of the graveyard versus the vineyard is brilliant. I can picture the sterile, horrifying perfection of the cemetery.
It is a very stark image.
Nobody ever argues in a graveyard. Nobody ever makes a mistake. It is perfectly orthodox and perfectly dead.
That is a great way to summarize it.
But the Italian vineyard has structure. It has posts and wires. But those structures exist solely to support the explosive growth of the fruit.
They facilitate the life.
This brings up the necessity of church discipline and structure. A congregation is not just a load of loose bricks dumped out of a wheelbarrow onto an empty lot.
A pile of bricks is not a house.
And a bundle of disconnected cuttings held in a gardener's hand is not a living vine. True spiritual vitality naturally creates arrangement. Every person has a place, and every soldier has orders.
And Spurgeon gets very specific here, assigning different banners to different roles within the congregation.
Yeah, he breaks it down nicely.
He says the Sunday school teachers bear the banner of the folded lamb. The people who visit the sick follow the ensign of the open hand.
Beautiful imagery.
The preachers rally to the uplifted brazen serpent. It shows that everyone, no matter their specific quiet gifting, is part of this mobilized force.
Everyone has a job to do.
But having an organized living vineyard of a church brings us to a massive point of friction.
Which is what?
An army that is well organized must actually mobilize. Structure without action is completely useless.
Ah, right. Sitting still does nothing.
And this moves us into the reality of the offensive campaign.
Yes, the transition from order to action is where many congregations fail.
It is a very common trap.
Spurgeon makes a very sharp, convicting observation about the nature of military colors. He points out that an army with its banners encased in cloth rolled up and tied tight is an army on furlough.
They are on break.
It is an army resting in the barracks. The fighting is over, the soldiers are sleeping, and the weapons are stored away.
Safe and sound.
But an army with uplifted, unfurled colors flapping in the wind means the troops are marching. They are actively exercising, or they are engaged in the middle of a hot campaign.
An unfurled banner is a declaration of active warfare.
All right, I'm going to stop you right there and play devil's advocate for a moment.
Okay, bring it on.
Because we need to talk about the reality of living in our current post-Christian culture. Let's look at a modern congregation.
Okay, let's look at one.
You have a pastor who loves his flock. He looks out at his congregation and sees families just trying to survive. He sees men who could lose their corporate jobs if they speak out on certain controversial cultural issues.
That is a very real pressure today.
It really is. He sees young people facing massive social cancellations at their universities if they fly their theological banners too high.
The stakes are high for them.
So the pastor thinks, isn't it far more prudent and far more loving to just keep our heads down? Let's just protect our own territory. We will keep our doctrine pristine inside these four walls. We will love each other, and we will avoid drawing unwanted artillery fire from the culture.
That sounds incredibly reasonable, pastoral, and protective.
Right. Why is it wrong for a church to just want to survive and avoid creating too much excitement? Why does Spurgeon demand that they march out into the firing line?
I appreciate you framing the objection that way, but Spurgeon vehemently dismantles that logic, and he does it by exposing what happens to a church when it adopts that defensive bunker mentality.
What happens to them?
He calls them the do-nothing churches, and his critique is withering. When a church decides to just hunker down and survive, it inevitably becomes stagnant, territorial, and eventually a hindrance to the gospel itself.
A hindrance? How so?
He describes congregations that hoard a specific district in a city. They treat their neighborhood like a monopolized domain, but they aren't actually reaching the lost people in it.
They just sit on the territory.
Even worse, if a new, energetic congregation plants a church down the street and starts evangelizing, the do-nothing church resents them.
Wow, they get jealous.
They view the new believers as poaching upon their manor. They are like the religious lawyers Jesus condemned in the Gospels who took away the key of knowledge. They do not enter in themselves, and they actively hinder those who are trying to enter.
That is a severe rebuke.
The theological mechanics here are absolute. The sole reasons for a church's existence on this earth are the mutual edification of the saints and the conversion of sinners.
If they are not doing that, they are failing.
If a congregation is not actively pursuing those two ends, what is it? It is a nuisance. It is salt that has lost its savor.
Just taking up space.
Jesus said salt that loses its saltiness is fit neither for the land nor for the dunghill. It is only good to be trampled underfoot.
Which is exactly what the culture does to a compromising church anyway.
Exactly. If the Lord redeemed his people by the shedding of his own blood, he did not pay that infinite price so they could sleep comfortably in the barracks. An encased banner is not a sign of prudence. It is a sign of dereliction of duty.
That is a harsh reality to swallow. The idea that a congregation trying to play it safe could actually become a nuisance, an impediment to just heavy baggage that the rest of the royal host has to drag along, should shake up any group that is settled into touchable stagnation.
It is a massive wake-up call.
So to march into this kind of active, offensive campaign requires a specific kind of boldness that refuses to apologize. And this brings us to the refusal to crouch.
Uplifted banners imply fearlessness.
Yes, a fearlessness that actually courts the conflict rather than fleeing from it. Spurgeon insists that the church must never preach with a coward's voice.
We cannot be timid.
We cannot apologize for our assertions or act embarrassed when our truth claims intrude on the consciences of the surrounding culture.
Which happens a lot today.
To illustrate this, he tells a fantastic historical anecdote about the Dutch ambassadors. Could you unpack that story for us and explain how it maps onto this idea of constancy?
Oh, the story of the Dutch ambassadors perfectly captures the posture the church is supposed to hold.
Tell us the story.
When these ambassadors were sent to negotiate with the Emperor of China, the cultural expectation of the Chinese court was absolute submission.
Like bowing and scraping.
The protocol demanded that foreign dignitaries crawl on their hands and knees up to the throne, paying humiliating, groveling homage to this earthly ruler before any business could be conducted.
That is intensely degrading.
But these Dutch ambassadors were representing a free nation, and they possessed a firm resolve. They looked at the emperor's officials and absolutely refused to crouch.
Good for them.
They stated that they would stand upright as free men to deliver their message, or else they would decline all dealings entirely.
And what was their alternative if the emperor refused?
They basically said the emperor could expect to hear the next message from the mouth of their cannons instead.
Wow. Talk about leverage.
They understood that to crawl would be to legitimize a false authority and degrade the sovereign they represented. Spurgeon uses this to highlight the immense pressure on the church to smooth her tongue.
The culture wants us to crawl.
The culture is constantly acting like an emperor, demanding that Christians crawl on their hands and knees, apologize for their exclusive claims, and tone down their doctrines to match the taste of the age.
But we cannot do that.
But the ambassadors of Christ cannot cringe. The moment a congregation begins to give up one doctrine here and soften another doctrine there, just to appease the dictates of cultural fashion, the entire structure is compromised. A little leaven ruins the whole lump.
I see that pressure to smooth our tongues everywhere today.
It is pervasive.
You sit in a conversation at work, and someone calls the exclusive claims of the gospel arrogant platitudes. Or someone casually claims that modern scientific consensus has completely overthrown the biblical worldview.
And you feel that tension in the room.
The immediate fleshly temptation in that moment is to backpedal. We want to soften the blow, use ambiguous language, and act a little bit embarrassed about the supernatural elements of our faith.
It is a natural human reaction to avoid conflict.
But Spurgeon points to the absolute efficacy of the gospel as the reason we can stand upright. We do not need to invent new, sophisticated philosophical methods to impress the world.
He uses the biblical examples of Gideon's army to prove this.
And we need to look at the mechanics of how Gideon's army actually won, because it is fascinating.
Let's hear it.
Gideon has 300 guys facing a massive, overwhelming encampment of Midianites spread out in a valley. God doesn't give them better swords or advanced military tactics.
He gives them a very strange arsenal.
He gives them clay pitchers with torches hidden inside and trumpets. They surround the camp in the dead of night. When the signal is given, they smash the clay pitchers, revealing the blazing torches, and they blow the trumpets.
It sounds like a psychological operation.
It was. The sudden shattering noise of the clay, combined with the blinding flash of light in the pitch black, creates a psychological shockwave. The Midianites wake up, assume they are surrounded by a massive army, panic, and turn their swords on each other.
The enemy defeated themselves.
Exactly. The simple, unadorned truth works exactly like those broken pitchers. When wielded with faith, the sudden flash of light overturns adversaries. It shatters the darkness. We don't need to add anything to the light. We just need to break the pitcher and let it shine.
The mechanics of that story are vital. The light did the work. The soldiers merely exposed it.
Well put.
And when a church holds fast to these core doctrines, when she exhibits true constancy, she becomes an immovable force. The truth is not something we edit to suit the tastes of the age. It is the voice of the eternal God.
It has creative force.
It possesses the same creative force that brought the physical universe out of nothing and will one day raise the dead from the grave.
That is a staggering thought.
Therefore, the ambassadors of Christ must stand upright, displaying their colors, fully confident that the simple preaching of the cross is the wisdom of God.
They have no reason to be embarrassed.
And it is this unapologetic, organized, active presence that leads us directly to the second major theme of this entire text.
Which is the fact that this beautiful bride is described as terrible.
Yes, we are talking about the nature of holy terror. Now, Spurgeon is very careful to clarify who should actually be afraid of the church and who should not.
That is a very needed clarification.
He states unequivocally that the church should be incredibly amiable, gentle, and welcoming to young converts or broken sinners seeking grace.
Of course.
If a church uses harsh judgments, moroseness, or bigotry toward a wounded person looking for Christ, that is a sign of absolute weakness, not strength.
A hospital should not terrorize the patients.
If a congregation is terrifying to a repentant sinner, something has gone drastically, fundamentally wrong. However, the church is genuinely, legitimately terrible to ungodly men who are entirely comfortable in their rebellion.
That distinction is crucial. The hospital should not terrify the patient seeking a cure, but it should absolutely terrify the disease.
I love that analogy.
He gives some incredibly practical examples of how this dynamic plays out in real life. He talks about men who are completely accustomed to using the most foul, ribald language with their buddies.
We all know guys like that.
But suddenly, a consistent, quiet Christian walks into the room, and that foul-mouthed man finds he cannot speak that way anymore.
The whole atmosphere shifts.
The fascinating part is that the Christian doesn't even have to hold any rank or authority. He isn't the boss. He might just be a junior employee. He hasn't said a word of condemnation, yet the mere presence of his holy life stops the ungodly in their tracks.
It is a quiet authority.
Spurgeon also gives the chilling example of an ungodly son who absolutely dreads living in the house where his departed father used to pray.
That is a haunting image.
The father is gone, but the son feels an oppressive weight. Every room, every quiet corner, every piece of furniture feels like a silent, vibrating rebuke against his current sin.
Goodness creates immense friction.
But how does this actually work mechanically? Why does quiet goodness provoke such a visceral reaction?
We have to understand the mechanics of this holy friction. This terror is not an affectation of demeanor.
It is not acting cuff.
No, it is not a Christian trying to act intimidating, wearing a scowl, or attempting to artificially impose dread upon his neighbors. That kind of self-righteous behavior just ends in deserved failure and cultural ridicule.
People see right through that.
True holy terror flows naturally from the solidity of virtue. Think of it like a mirror or a sudden floodlight.
Okay, a floodlight.
When a person fervently loves righteousness and hates evil, the mere outflow of their daily life acts as a blinding light in a dark room. The conscience of the ungodly person which they are desperately trying to suppress is suddenly awakened and bears witness against them in the presence of that genuine light.
The light exposes what they are trying to hide.
The holy life is the weightiest condemnation of sin because it proves that obedience to God is possible and joyful.
And people hate that proof.
And this unhallowed terror often provokes a violent retort. When you turn on a light in a dark room, the roaches scatter, but the people who love the dark will try to smash the bulb.
That makes perfect sense.
Because the ungodly fear the light that exposes them, their defense mechanism is to attack it. This dynamic is the exact root out of which slander, persecution, and martyrdom spring.
They cannot stand the exposure.
The darkness hates the light, precisely because the light makes its evil deeds manifest. In proportion to the earnest, Christ-like nature of a congregation, there will be a terror that strikes the perverse generation around it. They will dread it, just as they subconsciously dread the all-revealing day of judgment.
I want you, the listener, to pause and reflect on that reality for a second.
It is a very convicting thought.
Think about your own workplace, your own family dynamics, your own neighborhood. Does your life generate any of this holy friction?
Are you making the darkness uncomfortable?
Are people constrained in their blatant sin simply because you walked into the room carrying the light of Christ? Or, if we are completely honest, are we blending in so well that the darkness feels completely comfortable and at home around us?
If the darkness is never bothered by our presence, we have to ask ourselves if our banners are rolled up and hidden away in a closet.
Exactly. But this terror is not limited to individual ungodly men in their daily lives. It scales up. Entire systems of error are terrified by it.
Yes, the institutional level.
This brings us to the dread of systems and the demonic realm. Spurgeon looks at the broad landscape and identifies two massive Confederate armies opposing the church.
Ritualism and rationalism.
Right. Ritualism leans heavily into superstition, adding human traditions, priestcraft, and endless ceremonies to the gospel. Rationalism leans into sneering unbelief, stripping away the supernatural and reducing the faith to mere philosophy.
They are completely opposite ends of the spectrum.
Now, these two systems are polar opposites. They hate each other. Spurgeon compares them to Herod and Pilate, who were bitter rivals but suddenly became friends over their shared hatred of Christ.
A marriage of convenience.
These two massive systems agree on absolutely nothing except their unified desire to destroy the true gospel. But here is the detail from the text that I find so fascinating. These systems do not fear platform speeches.
They do not care about our lectures.
They do not fear philosophical discussions, academic panels, or intellectual debates. In fact, they welcome them. If systems of error actually welcome our philosophical debates, what is it that they actually dread?
They welcome debate because participating in a philosophical debate validates them as an equal intellectual peer.
Oh, that makes sense. It elevates them.
It keeps the battle on human terms, using human logic. What they actually dread, the ultimate weapon against which they have absolutely no defense, is the simple, prayerful preaching of the old gospel.
Just the bare truth.
When a congregation stops trying to outsmart the culture and instead relies entirely on the declaration of the truth as it is in Jesus, the foundation of those false systems begins to crack.
We see that in history,
The
right?
historical record bears this out undeniably. We look back at the efficacy of this weapon in the days of Martin Luther. Luther did not shake the entirety of Europe with sword or political maneuvering. He shattered the darkness by recovering and relentlessly preaching the simple doctrine of justification by faith alone.
A theological earthquake.
We look at the days of George Whitefield and John Wesley, where the simple, open-air preaching of the new birth awakened entire nations and altered the course of history.
That weapon still works today.
This weapon has lost none of its ancient capability, and it goes deeper than human systems. Satan himself is hard put when dealing with this kind of mobilized church.
Even the demonic realm reacts.
The demonic realm might be able to easily distract, isolate, or defeat a single individual operating alone, but when believers stop acting as lone rangers, bind themselves together in holy love, commit to mutual prayer, and form a spiritual temple where Christ dwells, the forces of darkness are genuinely terrified.
A united, praying, distinct congregation sends a shockwave of dread into the spiritual realm. That is a staggering thought, that a small group of ordinary people gathered in a room to pray and hear the gospel preached can send shockwaves into the demonic realm.
It shows the massive capacity of the local church.
And this brings us to the final, crucial clue of our deep dive. We have established that the church is terrible as an army with banners. But what is the actual root source of this terror?
Because it is not the people themselves.
No, if you look at the people in any given congregation, most are ordinary, many are poor, and very few have immense worldly influence or political leverage.
They are not naturally intimidating.
The terror does not come from their natural abilities, their wealth, or their intelligence. It comes from what they carry. We're looking at the banner of the cross and the elect host.
The chief majesty, the absolute source of the dread, lies entirely in the banner itself.
The uplifted Savior, the atoning sacrifice. Enemies dread the cross because they know what it has already accomplished.
Wherever the crucified Jesus is preached, false systems totter and fall.
Spurgeon uses the illustration of Dagon falling before the Ark of the Covenant. Could you unpack the mechanics of that Old Testament story to show how this works?
The story of Dagon is found in 1 Samuel, and it perfectly illustrates the inherent destructive force of God's presence against idolatry.
What happened in the story?
The Philistines had captured the Ark of the Covenant in battle. They viewed it as a massive trophy, so they placed it inside the temple of their chief god, Dagon, as a sign of submission.
Like putting a defeated enemy at the feet of their god.
But the next morning, the Philistine priests came into the temple and found the massive statue of Dagon fallen flat on its face on the ground before the ark.
It bowed down.
They propped the idol back up, assuming it was a structural accident. But the next morning, they came back, and not only was Dagon face down again, but his head and his hands were broken off on the threshold.
Total destruction.
The idol was decapitated and disarmed simply by being in the proximity of the true God. The cross of Christ operates the same way. It shatters idols not by human effort, but by its inherent reality.
The cross does the heavy lifting.
Spurgeon breaks down 3 specific reasons why the army itself, operating under this banner, is so terrible to its enemies. First, it consists of an elect people.
Elaborate on that.
He references the fascinating Old Testament story of Haman's wife, Zeresh. When Haman was plotting to execute Mordecai, he went home and told his wife about his brilliant plan.
And what did she say?
But when Zeresh found out that Mordecai belonged to the seed of the Jews, she immediately warned her husband that his scheme would fail and he would fall before him. She knew, even as a pagan, that there was a divine decree protecting that lineage.
She knew he was untouchable.
In the same way, the true members of the church are the seed of the woman ordained from of old to break the serpent's head. They are the weakness of God, but they are stronger than men because God has determined to use the things that are not to bring to nothing the things that are.
That sense of divine backing changes the entire posture of the soldier. What are the other two reasons this army is so terrible?
Second, they are a praying people. Prayer is the mechanism that links human weakness with infinite, inexhaustible resources.
It taps into the divine supply line.
In worldly warfare, if an army fights long enough, its reserve forces will eventually be depleted, its supply lines will be cut, and it will collapse from exhaustion.
Right, everyone has a breaking point.
But if an army can pray, its reserve forces can never be depleted. If one legion is exhausted, a praying church can call upon the Lord of hosts, and he will instantly dispatch 20 legions of angels.
You cannot starve out a praying church.
You cannot permanently defeat an adversary who has a direct, unseverable line to the sovereign of the universe. Third, this army is based on eternal truth.
How does he illustrate that?
Spurgeon uses a brilliant analogy here. He says falsehoods are like soap bubbles.
Bubble.
A soap bubble swells up large, it catches the sunlight, it displays brilliant rainbow colors, and for a brief moment, it looks far more impressive than a solid rock.
But it's incredibly fragile.
But it pops and vanishes almost instantly. The philosophies of the world, the newest cultural trends, the latest attacks on the biblical text, they are all soap bubbles. Truth outlasts the bubbles. Truth is invincible.
The rock remains after the bubble pops.
The enemies of the gospel have enough awareness left to realize that truth possesses an indestructible nature, and that realization fills them with dread. They know they are fighting a losing war.
I love how Spurgeon brings in that humorous anecdote about the awkward officer to illustrate how the church should respond to critics who hate our reliance on the cross.
Oh, that is a great story.
There was a military officer who was rather clumsy, and during a formal royal event, he kept tripping over his own sword. The king, watching this awkward display, got annoyed and complained, saying, "Your sword seems to be very much in the way."
And the officer's reply is legendary.
The officer immediately replied, "So your majesty's enemies have very often felt."
It is the perfect comeback.
It is such a brilliant, sharp response. And we could apply it directly to the critics who dislike the church's methods today. The enemies of the gospel are always telling us that our methods are outdated or offensive or awkward.
They want us to change our tactics.
They tell us that preaching substitutionary atonement is barbaric. They want us to adopt a new banner, a new philosophy that is more pleasing to their modern sensibilities.
But we should not listen to them.
But if the enemies of the truth dislike our method of relying solely on the old gospel, it is highly likely that our method is highly effective. Why in the world would we take tactical advice from the opposing army? We should be absolutely thrilled that our sword gets in their way.
Spot on. It would be tactical suicide to lay down the weapon that the enemy fears the most. We draw our sheer might, our unshakable courage, directly from the doctrine of substitutionary atonement.
Which is the core of the banner.
When we use that theological term, we are talking about the reality that Jesus Christ stood in the place of guilty sinners, absorbing the full blow of divine justice that we deserved.
The great exchange.
When a believer draws near to the cross and understands that mechanism, that their death has already been died, their penalty has already been paid, it changes everything.
It frees them from fear.
It removes the fear of death, which is the ultimate weapon of the enemy. It turns cowards into heroes. It makes believers swifter than eagles. The blood of Jesus is the absolute lifeblood of self-denial.
Because he died for us, we can lay down our lives.
We can die to ourselves, we can face cultural cancellation, we can endure persecution, and we can suffer hardship because our Savior died for us.
It is an unshakable foundation.
The presence of the Redeemer among his people provides a courage that no human philosophy, no stoicism, and no political movement can manufacture. When a church fully embraces the atoning sacrifice of Christ as her central standard, she becomes an immovable force.
She becomes terrible to the darkness.
She becomes terrible to the powers of darkness because those powers have a presentiment of her future, complete triumph. The demons know the end of the story. They know that all flesh shall see the salvation of God, and that the crucified one must conquer.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we turn the lens directly onto you, the listener. We have laid out this majestic, formidable picture of the church from Spurgeon's text.
It is a lot to take in.
But Spurgeon challenges his hearers personally, and we must do the same.
Oh.
Are you a soldier in this army? Or are you what he calls a lie-abed carpet knight?
Meaning someone who just likes the aesthetics of the military but hates the actual war.
Exactly. Are you someone who enjoys putting on the regimentals, wearing the uniform of a Christian profession on Sunday morning, but you never actually go to the war? Do you endure hardness? Does your daily life condemn sin in the specific environments where God has placed you?
Those are heavy questions.
Do you wear a label, openly identifying with the uplifted Savior, or are you so perfectly blended into the background of your workplace or your university that no one would even know you belong to the host without being told?
Those questions demand deep self-examination. And Spurgeon concludes his sermon with a chilling, solemn warning that we cannot ignore.
Set up that final scenario for us.
He asks his listeners to imagine the final scenario at the Last Judgment. Imagine someone who has sat in the pews of a local congregation for years. This person has heard the gospel faithfully preached week after week. They have seen the banners unfurled, but they have willfully, persistently rejected the mediator.
So they were in the church, but not of it.
When that person stands before the great judgment seat, the very church that prayed for them, the congregation they sat among, will become terrible as an army with banners.
That is a terrifying reversal.
The text indicates that the saints will act as co-assessors with the Son of God. When the righteous judge pronounces the verdict of condemnation on the one who knowingly rejected the truth, the entire church will say, Amen.
Wow. They agree with the judgment.
Not a single tongue will be raised to excuse the one who willfully refused the atoning sacrifice. The terror of the church will be fully realized in her absolute agreement with the righteous, flawless judgment of God. This is not a fiction. It is the reality of the coming kingdom.
It is a staggering reality, one that should drive us to our knees in gratitude for the mediator and immediately drive us to our feet to march under his banner.
Amen to that.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as we conclude our time in this text. We have seen that the church's greatest strength lies in her simple, unadorned witness to the truth of the gospel.
The broken pitcher.
Right, so ask yourself, what specific weapons or methods are modern Christians relying on today that might actually be keeping their banners rolled up and hidden from the world?
That is the big question.
If we are trusting in our own cleverness, our marketing strategies, or our cultural savvy rather than the terror of the cross, what are we sacrificing? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Charles Spurgeon's The Church as She Should Be. Until next time, keep your banners raised.